Alright everybody, welcome back, and today we're going to talk about hormones and behavior. I always like to point out, I was trying to have a little picture up front of that illustrates the topic at hand, and whenever I've looked Googled for hormones and behavior, nothing comes up except for this one book, and I have no idea why, but apparently this orangutan is illustrating that. I mean, I guess I kind of get it as something to do with mating behavior being shown here, but for whatever reason, people don't make pictures of this. Alright. So, learning objectives for this. There's a lot that we could cover here, but we kind of keep it focused for the purpose of this class. So, I want you to be able to predict how changes in hormone sensitivity and production affect behavior and neurology, right? We're not covering hormones 100% in the biology sense, but just they're trying to see how they work in with our nervous system. You should understand key roles of the hypothalamus, pituitary glands, and other organs in communicating with hormones. As we'll see here, hormones are the way that the brain can communicate besides just using neurites and axons and things, and it can communicate with the whole body. And then last, understanding how this idea of feedback regulation, how does basically, if you produce a hormone, how do you get that hormone to turn off? And the key ends up being, we produce a hormone somewhere, that should lead to a signal back to turn it back off. If this doesn't happen, that can result in disease or other abnormal states. Right, so basic principles of hormone. What is a hormone? Hormones are chemical signals that are often produced in one gland, enter the circulatory system, and act on distant organs where they influence physiology and behavior. They can be a whole bunch of things. They can be small molecules, peptides, other metabolites, and there are two main effects of hormones. You can have organizational effects and active effects, which we'll dive in more deeply in a bit. The key thing here, though, as I say, I'm never always a huge fan of specific definitions, but the key part here is that some sort of chemical signal and it's acting on a distance, right? One cell right next to each other, talking to each other, that's not how hormones work. This is your brain sending a signal, usually through the bloodstream or some other way, that gets throughout the whole body. Hypothalamus is going to be the key part of the brain here. It's a master regulator. And then again, like I said, most endocrine pathways. Endocrine is a word that you'll see. Endocrine system, that could be like your hormonal system. Most of these pathways ultimately result in negative feedback, where the last step basically turns off the previous step. And balance is the key, right? We don't want too much or too little in almost any case. Right, and then we'll talk a bit how this fits in with nature versus nurture. All right, so hypothalamus is the key part of the brain, but another key part, and it's always sort of, is the pituitary gland, part of the brain, or sort of this interface between the brain and the rest of the body. But these are really the main parts that we're going to talk about as part of your nervous system that works. Right, so this is a different angle that you're looking at, but this is your hypothalamus up here, and then it connects to the pituitary gland down here. The pituitary gland has tons of different blood vessels that go into it, and that's important because this is how we put hormones into the system, and there's also a lot of receptors here for different hormones so that those signals can get sent to the brain. So hormones are going all through your circulatory system, your blood vessels, and this is one of the key places that they both enter the blood vessels and when they're detected and send those signals to the brain. And like I said, hormones can do a huge number of different things. You might think of growth hormone, right? This is one of those things that athletes now get tested for to make sure that they're not using too much of, but it's a normal part of life too. Signal that tells you to grow when you need to grow. And this is also why a lot of the people who have become giants, like literal giants by the medical definition, far abnormal growth, often have tumors of the pituitary gland or potentially hypothalamus that cause gross overproduction of human growth hormone, right? Thyroids, oxytocin, all these different things can be regulate both the size and function of different organs from the brain. It's basically the way the brain sends signals to other parts of the body. So, two effects of sex hormones. Right, and for the first right here, we're going to focus mostly on sex hormones, and then later on we'll talk about other effects of hormones. Organizational effects. These usually occur early and are long-lasting. whereas activating effects occur at any time and are usually more temporary. So the key organizational effect can be something like sex determination, whereas a key, like the one that everybody talks about for activating effects, tends to be their menstrual cycle. Right? And so here's an example of the menstrual cycle, where basically, and there's a few different hormones here. This is just showing estrogen and progesterone, where these are released in a combination between the pituitary gland and the ovaries in females, and basically one going up causes the other to go down in cycles like this. But the key thing I want to bring out here and bring it back to neuroscience is that there's a unique finding that we've never 100% understood, although we can make some guesses about how this means, is that if you look at estrogen here, we're going to focus on here, right? It has two different peaks. And what we've seen, and this seems to carry through to humans, but definitely most of these studies within animals, is that if we look in a certain part of your brain, under normal circumstances, you can see these little spines here that we've talked about before. These each indicate that the synapse is coming there. And this is sort of the baseline control. However, in females, when estrogen is high, we see a huge increase in these spines in number of synapses. So what does this mean? Again, there's actually a large body of literature that's looked into this, but as a guy, I don't think I can help think, but this is guys all the time, whereas as women get to have sort of extra synapses, probably, and that's got to be useful for something, right? So as we're sort of normal amount of dumb 28 days in a row, women get sort of half the time get to have these extra synapses. Seems a little unfair, but I guess that's the way it is. Now, we have no clue if well, actually we have some. There are some that actually do literally indicate this leads to increased intelligence and problem-solving abilities at times when estrogen is high. But we really don't understand exactly what this is. One thing that I'm always curious about, and we may talk about this in class, is the idea of if you think about school, right, and we're treating everybody equally, but at some point, women have an unfair number of synapses here, right? So is that fair to men to give them that? Or should we be worrying about sort of what time in a woman's menstrual cycle they're taking an exam? Is that how we should be thinking about this? Honestly, we're not, but it's an interesting question. All right. So, sex organ development. I think we hopefully all have a basic understanding of how this should work, so we're going to focus on sort of the abnormal or intersex cases, right? The basics are that we should know that, you have sex chromosomes, right? At the XX for women and XY for males. But there are cases where that's not so clear cut. So it's estimated that about 1 in 100 babies are actually born with some level of genital ambiguity. And in most of these cases, this sort of resolves itself. It's actually not that complicated. About 1 in 2,000 have enough ambiguity that it's actually pretty uncertain if you should call them a male or a female. All right. And this showed up. So this is an example of organizational effects, right? Because this is a permanent change. So one way that you can get this is have XX chromosomes, but the SRY gene is from a normal Y chromosome is sort of attached to one of these X chromosomes. So you can be XX, but have a little bit of the Y chromosome, and this can make you somebody who is XX but also has some male characteristics, and results in atypical hormone exposure patterns. Another way you can get this is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where basically the adrenal glands overdevelop, produce too much cortisol, and in large enough amounts to exert negative feedback on ACTH, which is basically adrenaline or the male hormone, and then adrenals overproduce testosterone, right? So whereas estrogen is the female hormone, testosterone is the sort of main male hormone. And you can have this case where you have adrenal glands producing too much cortisol and leading to too much testosterone in a female as well, right? So you can think through this question for next time. You can also have an androgen insensitivity. Basically, the androgen receptor or the testosterone receptor is decreased or absent from cells. So think about what would happen here if you had an individual who is XY. They should, by sort of genetics, look like they should become male in that case and develop male sexual organs. However, they aren't able to respond to the testosterone hormone signal. How would that develop? So, anabolic steroids, right? This fits in that they are basically mimic testosterone. That's what they're meant to do, and led to sort of increase the male features. One of those male features is that men tend to have more muscle tissue than females. That's why they get used. Side effects, however, are quite complex, and I think illustrate that hormones are really complicated. And this is a general thing you'll see in sort of endocrine diseases. Rarely is there a clear cut, just give them more, just give them less, because there's this whole balance of things that's happening at once. So, for example, they may have more acne, and you can see how this would be related to testosterone tends to kick up during puberty, and that's also when we see more acne. More body hair and male pattern baldness. These are, again, male characteristics. Cancer. Now, this one seems not to fit in so well, but I think the key to think here is that cancer is basically making too many cells and too much tissue. And if you are having a hormone that is potentially telling your body to produce more cells, you have the possibility that this could get out of control. Testicular atrophy. Well, now this one seems to be the opposite of what I've just said. Basically, this is your testes will start to deteriorate, right? So why does that come if they're trying to be more male? Well, the problem there is that, remember, there's this whole balance thing. So your testes are basically used to receiving a certain amount of testosterone, and now they're getting sort of out of balance where you've increased it sort of artificially, and now they're not getting it at the regular basis they're expected to. And that could lead to things like infertility, usually temporary, likely, I guess, right? And then there's the whole range of different behavioral things, mania, depression, roid rage. People literally, and this is showing, get angry more. And this is definitely related to sort of these actually being kind of more male behaviors. And a lot of times the males are more aggressive than females on average. But the exact where these are working is not clear. The concept of sexual dimorphism is a little bit fraught, but it seems to have some basis in reality. And the term really means how is your brain different between men and women, right? So what is different between a man's brain and a woman's brain? And you can start to see where that's a little bit territory you want to be careful in, but it's also been quite complicated because we're really mostly looking at sort of correlation studies again here. And so this diagram here is taking a bunch of different MRI studies that have shown differences between men and women's brain on average. And you can see the pink areas of the brain are larger in women. Notice that there seems to be a lot more brain tissue that's larger in women, and then the blue areas seem to be larger in men. Now, the problem is that what's an average brain, right? It doesn't mean that if you have, I'm not even sure 100% right, but this is sort of looking like motor and sensory cortex up in this region. It doesn't mean if you have a slightly bigger motor or sensory cortex that you have to be a woman or a female. It's just saying that there does seem to be a trend there, and a lot of times these trends are small. Now, there are some very specific areas that seem to be more correlated with it, but still, it's largely correlation. We haven't really found any causation links. Right. So, in coming back to this then, gender identity. Key point to say up front here is that how one identifies sexually, what do you call yourself? That's gender. And animals don't have gender. So this is the difference between sex and gender. Sex is purely, and especially in animal, right? If you XX or XY, that's what sex you are. But gender is sort of is more of an identity. How do you perceive yourself? So remember, CAH, females really sort of develop anatomically more like males and exhibit interest and preference more similar to boys and girls even before puberty. The sort of shame in this is that these historically CAH females, due to the fact that it's a little bit crude, but the idea is that they would have genitals that were sort of ambiguous, and basically it's easier to remove tissue than to add tissue, so they would end up changing their sort of genital appearance to become more female, but then later on they would behaviorally seem to identify more as a male, and then they would request assignment back to male genitalia sort of later in life. And this goes along too with you can have different discrepancies of sexual appearance. A botched circumcision. It wasn't that long ago too that if a circumcision went wrong, the main thing to do was just to try and raise that individual as a woman, and that doesn't always work well because we know that there's more to it than just sort of the physical appearance of sex organs. Right. Also talking about sexual orientation. This is complicated as well. And again, another one of these areas where I feel like you always have to be a little bit careful because people, I think, naturally have very strong feelings about this. And I want to be clear, like much of neuroscience, we don't have answers, but we have some ideas here. So adult hormone levels are the same between adult homosexuals and heterosexuals. So there's no obvious, some people had the thought, and they did these tests because the thought was if it was not having enough testosterone or enough estrogen, maybe that's why you became started to identify as a homosexual, right? Or having hormone levels that more mimic the other sex, but that seems to be untrue. There are slight shifts in brain anatomy toward a feminized brain in homosexual men. So again, I think you have to be really careful there. These seem to be not causative, or we have no proof that any of this is causative, but there is a correlation, so there may be something there, but certainly further study is required. So you can see a number of different areas here. Hemisphere size, amygdala connections, anterior commissure, suprachiasmatic nucleus, one of my favorite names to say. They all seem to have differences that make sense. Suprachiasmatic nucleus, I'm never really sure how that works. This is actually what's important for regulating your circadian rhythms or your biological 24-hour clock. But apparently this seems to be slightly different. The one that has the best evidence for seeing some difference is the third interstitial nucleus of anterior hypothalamus. And that's interesting because now the hypothalamus, right, that makes a little more sense. You can understand functionally why that might be there. And we actually have studies from human brain tissue to sort of back this up. Where it's showing a heterosexual male, right, you can see this is the region here they're showing, and a homosexual male. And they didn't just look at two brains, one of each. They looked at several, and they consistently did see this different in size. And this is much more similar to a female brain. So maybe there's something there. And if you are more interested in this Simon LeVay, who wrote this paper, he has continued on as an author, actually, primarily is what he does. He used to be a well-known scientist and is now a reasonably well-known author. And he has written extensively about this, and is a homosexual man himself. He sort of feels he has a good understanding. I've seen him talk. He's a very good speaker, so I think you can actually find YouTube videos out there as well of him. All right, and again, like a lot of things here when we're looking at anatomy, we don't know if it's causative or correlative, right? So that's a key difference there. All right, so that is it for this video, and there'll be a follow-up video that comes back to the role of hormones in feeding.